So it's great to be back. I can't believe it's been almost 6 months since I was here, but it has. And I got the idea to do this from the last time I was here, where I talked briefly about my own experiences. And then that same Sunday, a lady mentioned that there had been 2 suicides that week in this county. And so it was on my mind since then. And then Nadia Bowes-Weber, who is a Lutheran pastor, had put out a video on suicide and how the church has messed it up, got it wrong, and assigned blame. And so that entered my mind to like, maybe I should do this. And it wasn't until like 3 weeks ago that I finally decided, yeah, this is what I'm going to do. I'd actually written something completely different. But here we are. So I'm going to warn you now that there's going to be a lot of information in here. And some of it may be very hard to hear, but it's what you need to hear. So feel free to ask anything during the talkback. So to begin with, I want to lay down what suicide actually is by definition and what a suicide attempt is by definition, because a lot of times people don't know the difference between those. So suicide is when someone directs violence at themselves with the intent to end their own lives, and they die as a result of their actions. It is best to avoid terms like commit suicide or a successful suicide when referring to a death by suicide, as these terms carry negative connotations. We will discuss this more later. A suicide attempt is when people harm themselves with the intent to end their own lives, but do not die because of their actions. Believe it or not, suicide affects us all. I personally do not know anyone who has not been affected by suicide in some way or another. Suicide is like a pebble in a pond. The waves ripple outward. What I mean by this is when someone dies by suicide, the people impacted most dramatically are those closest to that person who died. Family, friends, co-workers, and classmates. As a result, the people who are regularly interacting with this person are the ones who end up physically missing the person at that moment, for they have the memories. However, when you look at suicide moving forward, the community is impacted, the church is impacted, the teachers who knew the student are impacted, the first responders who came are impacted, the doctors are impacted. So it ripples outward. So while it may have affected 3 people in one moment, a week later, a month later, a year later, it's touched the entire community. So by that regard, suicide is a ripple effect. People who attempt suicide sometimes feel that they aren't making an impact on the world in any meaningful way. In a situation where the individual has struggled openly with mental illness, concerns of who they are, they struggle, they feel pain, and they feel loss, likely wondering, what good are they? So what we end up doing is we worry about what we did. What didn't we do? If we had done something differently, would that individual still be here? And we make it about ourselves and not about the individual. People who may not have ever personally known the individual who died are definitely impacted. Like I said, emergency personnel are impacted, for they were the ones that showed up. They were the ones that saw, however gruesome it was, the moment. And they're the ones that are going to have those memories for the rest of their lives, even though they may not know the individual's name. Okay, so let's take a minute to collect our thoughts, to breathe, and to bring our minds fully present into this gathered community. Okay, now it's for the hard part, actually talking about in depth suicide itself. I want to be clear here that I am not a mental health expert. I do not claim to be, and that I have struggled with my own thoughts of suicide and actions before. Luckily, none of them were successful. However, this is why I feel qualified to speak on this subject. I also want to be clear that I have no concrete answers, that there are no concrete answers, and that this topic has been done wrong over and over again by churches. I want to acknowledge that it's been used to historically hurt people and to make people feel that suicide is never an answer. I'm not going to get into that, but that is out there. So, we often stay silent about suicide because it's hard, it's painful, and we frankly don't want to discuss something that we don't understand. But by doing this, we aren't fixing anything, we aren't addressing anything, and in fact, we're ignoring the very essence of what it's trying to tell us. For those who struggle with mental illness, they need us to talk about suicide. They need us to talk about mental illness and to treat it just like we would a broken arm. You wouldn't look at someone and say, oh, you have a broken arm, that'll heal. You wouldn't tell someone, oh, you have cancer. Okay, well, it'll go away, because it won't. So why do you look at someone who has mental illness, who causes them to think about suicide as their way out, and say, oh no, this will pass, you're fine, there's nothing wrong. So for myself and for millions of others who suffer from mental illness, the most challenging and painful thing that we have to deal with is not the mental illness itself, but it's that we have to live with the stigmas associated with the mental illness put on us by society. People often live with mental illness, and it's something that we can't change. I can't say, today I'm not going to have a mental illness because society tells me not to have one. Someone who's thinking about ending their own life can't say, oh, that my pastor told me not to kill myself. The Bible tells me not to kill myself, which isn't true, and we'll talk about that in a minute as well. But that's what people believe, because that's what we've been told by society. So the worst thing to do is to tell someone that it's going to be okay because it doesn't exist. Telling someone with a mental illness that their mental illness isn't the cause of their pain isn't the right thing to do. So, I have a mental illness. I was diagnosed at a young age. I have had suicide attempts, and I'm not the only one. I've been told time and time again that it's my fault, that all these things are not real, that I can just essentially turn it off and everything will be okay, and that's not the truth. So, that's something you never know just looking at an individual. But when someone tells you that, a lot of us, myself included, even though I have a mental illness, our immediate response is to make it well, I'm going to help you through this, but by you saying that, what a lot of us are doing is we're saying, okay, now this is about me and how I feel about you. When someone says that they are suicidal, oftentimes what we do is we say, well, you can't do that because think about this, I'll miss you, they'll miss you, this will happen, that will happen, and it's not okay. So here's what we're going to do about this. We don't try to help in the moment, we try to get them to stop. And that's not suicide prevention. That's you, not them. So no matter the type of mental illness someone might have, they are all different. Everyone's journey with mental illness is different. No mental illness is going to be the same, and no one solution for mental illness is going to be the same. Just like no one solution for suicide prevention is going to be the same. What might work with one person probably won't work with the next person. So it's about learning how to talk about suicide, the tools to use in suicide prevention, which we'll talk about in a minute, and the conversations to have. It's about changing how we think about mental illness and removing the stigmas around mental illness and treating it just like any other medical condition, because it is a medical condition. Stigmas around mental illness lead to silence, and silence does not stop the ripple effect. It just leaves people feeling isolated and alone, and as if they are facing this tragedy alone. Thus, being silent about suicide actually leads to more suicides. Let that sink in. When we are silent about suicide, as we are so often, it leads to the suicide that we were trying to prevent by not talking about it. When someone dies by suicide, the aftermath can be daunting. And we all have a role to play in the prevention and decreasing the stigma of mental health and of suicide. So, I know we've talked briefly about how people respond to suicide, but now I want to talk a little bit more about that. So, first and foremost, we mourn the sudden loss of someone. Just like we would if someone had been hit by a car and died. We mourn. But what makes suicide different is a lot of times we then assign blame. We say that they did this to themselves, that they're going to hell. I know what you use, so we don't necessarily believe that, but that's what historically has been said, is because this person took their life, they are somehow less important than the person who got hit by the car. Which is a little weird to think about, but that's what we do. We blame ourselves. We say, well, maybe if I hadn't have said something to that person the last time I talked to them, maybe this wouldn't have happened. Maybe if I had just noticed one of the warning signs, that this wouldn't have happened. Maybe if they had found a church, this wouldn't have happened. But then what we're doing with that is we're ignoring the suicide itself, and we're trying to find a reason that it happened. We become angry. We might feel that it's our fault and lash out and fight and yell at each other because we feel that, well, it's not me that did it, it's someone else. So that's not fixing it either. And then the number one thing that we do is we try to make sense of a suicide. We try to find the truth of the suicide, and we try to piece together a narrative that coheres to logic. Why did they do this? But we can't. And the reason that we can't do that is because we can never truly know what someone else is thinking or what is in their mind unless they tell us. But even then, they may be telling you what you want to hear. They may not be telling you that they're suicidal and that they have a plan in action and that tomorrow they're going to kill themselves. And this goes back to that idea of stigma. For if they tell you that, they feel that you're going to judge them, that you're going to blame them, that you're going to tell them not to do this because it will hurt you, not because it'll relieve their pain. So, again, I'm not saying suicide is the answer, but for someone who is suicidal, it is not about you. It is about them in that moment and what needs to happen in that moment. And by assigning blame and making it about yourself, you could be driving them to suicide. So switching gears a little bit, but still talking about suicide, how many of you know that there are stories of suicide in the Bible? How many of you know that there are actually 7 stories of suicide in the Bible? So one of the most common, and yes, this is weird because there's a Bible in a UU church now, but it goes along with it, so like, alright, we're going to do this. But the story of Judas, as told in the book of Matthew. So it goes on to talk about it's talking about the Last Supper. And it's immediately after the Last Supper when Jesus tells Judas, what you're about to do it fast, and Judas leaves. So the story in Matthew picks up the next morning. And it says, when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he went to the priest, feeling remorse for what he had done. He told the priest, take this, for I have sinned, for I have betrayed innocent blood. They looked at him and said, what good of this is to us? For it is your responsibility. So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went and hung himself. The story of Judas is also talked about in the book of John, where it says, the devil entered into Judas and put it into his heart to betray Jesus. The devil lied to Judas, saying that his death was more important than his life. Nowhere in that or in any of the other 6 areas in the Bible where suicide is mentioned does it once mention it is a sin. Instead, it mentions betrayal, regret, remorse, loss, suffering, pain, injustices done. But sin is not mentioned. But somehow we have come to the conclusion that suicide is a sin and something to repent from. So now I'm going to talk about some of my own attempts. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because that's not what this is about. But like I said, I have had several suicide attempts. And they all stem from stigma. They all stem from mental illness and from feelings of isolation. So for me, my first attempt, I was 13. I was being bullied in school. I was receiving death notes because I had just come out as being gay. And I couldn't handle it. I was afraid to go to the counselors because who knows if they're going to be extremely conservative Christian counselors and assign blame and do what I talked about earlier by saying that this isn't something you do, and look at this Bible verse that says that you don't do this, which isn't what I would need. So instead of talking to someone, instead of reaching out for help, I started cutting myself. I started self-medicating. I did all kinds of things to try to relieve the pain, and suicide attempts were a part of that. And this went on and on for years. That wasn't my only attempt. I honestly don't know how many attempts I have made in my life. Because a lot of times, and this is true for a lot of people with mental illness, in the moment, you don't know you're doing it. In that moment, part of your brain shuts off. So you might know that you're doing it in that instant, but 3 hours later, you might look down at your wrist and wonder, why are there cuts? You might think, why is my head hurting? And not remember that you did that because your body is automatically trying to fix itself. Just like with the broken arm, your body, as soon as you break your arm, automatically sends extra blood to that area to try to relieve the pain. So it's the same idea. Your body is trying to prevent it. And so you don't necessarily remember every single instance of every single event. So I know that's a lot to take in. But what the most important thing, if you only remember one thing from today, is that it takes a community to mend what is busted up and what is broken. And in our society, what is broken is the way we treat people with mental illness. We all need help at some point. We all need a friend. We all need someone to talk to. We all need someone to just look at us, tell us that we matter, that it's okay to be in pain, that it's okay to have suicidal thoughts, because at the end of the day, it is. So what we need is we all need somebody to lean on. So what this, like I said, this song is in the tail hymnal for the UA. And the whole message behind the song is about community. It's saying that we can't do this alone. Whatever it is, if it's suicide, if it's the death of a loved one, if it's a divorce, if it's someone who is failing all of the classes in school, you can't do it alone. And so we all need somebody to lean on. We all need somebody to be with us, to stand with us, to stay with us during hard times in our lives. So from music to God to the spirit of life, love, whatever you wish to call that is greater than ourselves, they all have something in common. They all connect us to a source of hope. They all connect us to strength. And they all inspire us to live our lives in love. What we must do now is we must seek to defy and renounce all that defies love. We must remind each other that who we are matters, that every part of an individual matters, including mental illness, including those parts that society says should not matter. For it is every part of who we are that matters. So no matter what, we always, always must remember love. We must work to understand life around us, knowing that we are all worthy of love, and that no person is outside the circle of love. For when we do that, we become a part of the problem and not a part of the solution. So, again, switching gears a little bit, that's pretty much the end of the sermon or talk part of it. But since this is about suicide, and I know I've mentioned warning signs and talked about suicide and how it affects a lot of people, I want to give you some of the warning signs and some statistics. And I'm gonna give you a handout during the talk back that you can take home with you, because I don't expect you to remember this. So these statistics come from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and Awareness. And they are the suicide facts and figures for the state of Tennessee for the year 2019 thus far. So thus far, in 2019, in the state of Tennessee alone, on average, one person dies by suicide every 8 hours.
Oh my God. Wow.
Over 4 times as many people have died by suicide in Tennessee in 2017 than that of alcohol-related motor vehicle accidents. The total deaths of suicide reflect a total population, or a total of 22,889 before the age of 65. It is the third leading cause of death for those 15 to 24. It is the 9th leading cause of death in the state of Tennessee. It is the 2nd leading cause of death for those 25 to 34. And the 4th leading cause of death for those 34 to 55. In Tennessee thus far, in 2019, there have been a reported, and it's important to note that these are only the ones that were reported as suicide. For whatever reason, there has been a reported 1,167 suicides in the state of Tennessee. Tennessee is the 22nd most ranking state in the nation for suicide. Suicide has cost the state over $1 billion. So let that sink in. Like I said, I don't expect you to remember all of those numbers. That's why I have them in front of me. So, some of the warning signs, and by warning sign, I mean these are things that if you're wondering, is someone suicidal, or things that you look for in someone to know if they're suicidal, these are the things that you want to be looking for. It's important to note that some of these may not even be suicide related, but they are things that we all do. Some of them are very, very concrete suicide related. So one of the most concrete ones is talking about wanting to die or to kill themselves. That one you can automatically say, yes, this person might be suicidal. But what about talking about feeling hopeless or lost or having no purpose? That could be someone in a midlife crisis. That could be a college student who is changing their major, who feels that college isn't right for them. But it could also be someone who is suicidal. Talking about feeling trapped or being in unbearable pain. Again, could be someone who is suicidal. Could also be someone who lives with chronic pain, who is in no way suicidal. So some of these aren't, like I said, concrete yes or no, but it's a checklist. You know, things to look for, things to talk about. So another one, talking about being a burden to others. Could be a sign of suicide. Increased risk of, or increased use of alcohol and drugs. It's a definite warning sign. So it's important to talk to someone if you notice that there's an increased use of alcohol or drugs in their life. Acting anxious or reckless. Sleeping a little or way too much. Withdrawing, giving things away. Showing rage when talking or looking like you're seeking revenge. Extreme mood swings from day to day. Again, that could be just mental health in general. It could be someone who lives with bipolar depression disorder. But it could also be a sign of suicide. Some of the risk factors. Risk factors do not cause or predict to a suicide, but whether they are on another list of characteristics that make it more likely for an individual to consider, attempt, or die by suicide. So, number one, mental disorder. Schizophrenia, anxiety, any form of depression. Those individuals are at a higher risk of dying by suicide than those not living with a mental disorder. Alcohol and drug use. Impulsive or aggressive tendencies. History of trauma or abuse. So someone who has been abused in their life is more likely than someone who has not been abused in their life to take their own life. Major or physical or chronic illness that there is no cure for. So if you live with chronic back pain and have so for years, and doctors have told you time and time again that there's nothing that they can do for you, that they can stop the pain for maybe a minute or two, but this is something you're going to have to live with for the rest of your life. Suicide might be what you look for. Previous attempts in an individual or a family history of suicide. So if you know for a fact that someone attempted suicide before, they are probably going to attempt it again at some point in their lives. If you know that 6 months ago a person lost a loved one to suicide, suicide might be what they do because that is what's on their mind and they can't survive without that loved one. Easy access. So if there are guns, drugs, knives in the house and you know someone is suicidal, get those out. Local clusters of suicide. So like what happened here. One individual took their own life. Because of that, and because of the ripple effect, in this county, another individual took their life. They were related because of the ripple effect. Because that person knew that person or had been touched by that person in some way, and in turn, they did the same. So there are list after list of factors, of preventative factors, of things that we can do, things that we should be doing And like I said, I'm going to give you this. But the number one thing, and I've said this over and over again, what we have to do is we have to be there for one another. We have to be with one another. We have to love one another, and we have to treat mental illness just like any other disease, broken bone, or medical condition. And we have to do it now. If you can't believe it for yourself, let me believe it for you. For I don't know when I'm going to need someone to believe it for me. So thank you.
Thank you.